Well, I just finished participating in the Rails Rumble contest this weekend, so it's been a pretty busy week. So I'm just going to keep this episode on the shorter side and just give you a few quick tips on how to work with the built-in Rails helpers outside of the Vue layer. Now, Rails comes with a lot of built-in helper methods. These are just a few of them in one of the helper modules. But as you can see, there's a lot of helper modules that we have access to. Now, a lot of these methods are very specific to the Vue layer, so if you ever want to use one outside of the Vue, you might, double check yourself and question yourself, is this really belong outside of the Vue layer? But sometimes it does. Some of these helper methods are just very valuable all around your application. So for example, the pluralize method. Let's say I want to use this in a model layer to format maybe a category's description or something. And just the logic of pluralizing a word only on certain cases on how many counts you have of some object, that just makes a lot of sense, even outside of the Vue layer. So let's try this, implementing this in the model layer. Let's take a look at an example. We have a category model and it has many products. And our category has a description attribute. And what this does is just basically tell you how many products are in this category. But we want to handle the pluralization of this word dynamically, so if it's one product, then it says one product here and not the plural version. Well, we have a helper method, the pluralize helper method, which does just that. But how do we access that helper method from our model? Well, one way we could do that is to include the helper module directly into this model. Well, if we take a look back at the API, we can see this is the name of the module which has these helper methods in it. And so what we could do in here is just include that helper module. And then that will add all those helper methods directly into this model and give us access to them all. So we can use the pluralize method directly into here. And just add the singular version into here, and then it will pluralize it as needed. Now this is kind of a cool trick, but it's not really something I recommend doing, especially very often. I would just caution you to be very careful with this approach because it really is adding a lot of methods into this model which you may not really need. And it just clutters up your namespace of methods. It may override some, and some helper modules rely on other helper modules. So you may need to include multiple ones to really get the effects that you want. So this technique works, but it's not something I would recommend doing very often, or just do it with caution. So instead of doing this, let's take a look at a different approach, which I definitely prefer, but I haven't seen used very often. And that is to actually use a class method on the action controller base class called helpers. If I spell it right. And what this does is return a helper proxy object, which you can use to access any of the helper methods, except it doesn't work for URL specific helper methods, but I'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, for this kind of case, it works perfect. So all we have to do is just call any kind of helper method on this object, like the pluralize helper method. Now, calling this big string of methods isn't very clean here. So what we can do is just make a new method called helpers in our model and just return that. So that way, if we ever need to access helper methods, it's a little bit simpler. You just call helpers and then just call any helper method on that one method. Now, as I mentioned, this doesn't work for URL-related helper methods because the logic is very specific to the current request for those. And the model is not tied in any way to the current request, so it can't access that kind of information. This is one reason why session state, the current session, is not accessible from the model layer. But let's take a look at an example where we want to use the URL-related helper methods from a controller, where it does have access to the current request. So here we are inside of a products controller. And let's say when we create a project, we display a flash message and then we go back to the products index page. But let's say we want to provide a convenient link inside the slash message to go to that specific product show page. Now, normally you don't see links inside of flash messages, I think just because they're kind of a pain to do. This is usually done inside of the controller, and you don't have access to that link to helper method and so on that you have in the Vue. So how do we go to the show action and provide a link here? Well, you could provide some manual HTML here. That's not very pretty. You could maybe use a render to string or something, but I think a little bit simpler approach is to use the template instance variable. Now I'm not entirely sure if this is fully supported by Rails and what you should do, so kind of use it at your own risk, but it seems to work from my testing. So what we can do here is use the template instance variable and just call helper methods on this directly like you would inside of a view. So you can say link to, and then just link to this product. We'll just call it product, and then link to that product instance variable here. So let's try this out inside of let's make a new product here. And then there it is. There's a product link, and it goes to that specific product page and the proper URL and everything because we use that template instance variable in the controller. So this episode turned out to be a little longer than I expected actually, but I think it should be pretty useful for some of you. So if you ever wanted to use helper methods outside of the view for some odd reason or another, there's a couple techniques you can use and to do so. This episode is sponsored by Pragmatic Screencasts. There you will find high-quality screencasts on a variety of subjects, including Ruby and Rails. Check them out at pragmatic.tv.